Greetings. My name is Bishop Thomas Gordon, and I serve as the seminary's 7th president, and I also will be your instructor today, providing you an introduction to the Apocrypha. When I was a young boy, I can remember stumbling across a very old edition of the Bible, a very large and very old edition of the Bible, a couple hundred years old, which was ancient to me at the time. And I remember opening up the Bible and seeing the strange typeface in it, and also seeing that there were books and stories in this Bible that were not in the Bibles I was accustomed to. And one of those stories included a story about a dragon. Well, needless to say, that interested me a great deal. All our Bibles, all the King James Bibles that were printed up until a couple hundred years ago, had the books of the Apocrypha in them. Today, you will have to go out of your way to find a copy of the Bible with the Apocrypha. I want to quote from one of our texts for our course, Richard Denton. He said, "The Apocrypha continued to be read and studied by Protestants and to be commonly printed as part of the Bible down to the beginning of the 19th century. The final blow struck against the Apocrypha was when the British and Foreign Bible Society, followed by the American Bible Society, decided in 1827 not to include the apocryphal books in their editions of the Bible. The practice swiftly spread to other publishers for obvious reasons of economy, and it soon became difficult to obtain ordinary editions of the Bible which included them. Although, as Goodspeed points out in his book, The Story of the Apocrypha, they are an integral part of the King James translation of the Bible, and any edition which omits them is incomplete and should contain a note to that effect." So what is the Apocrypha? Well, if you take a look at your Book of Common Prayer and you turn to the back of the Book of Common Prayer, you can see the books of the Apocrypha enumerated there. You have the 3rd book of Esdras, the 4th book of Esdras, the book of Tobit, the book of Judith, the rest of the book of Esther, the book of Wisdom, or the Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiasticus, or Sirach, or Jesus the son of Sirach, Baruch the prophet, the Song of the Three Children, the story of Susanna, of Bel and the Dragon, which are the additions to Daniel, the prayer of Manassas, the 1st book of Maccabees, and the 2nd book of Maccabees. Those are the books of the Apocrypha enumerated in the Book of Common Prayer, in the 39 articles. What does the Apocrypha mean? Well, in another one of our texts, Bruce Metzger, in his introduction to the Apocrypha, he says the term Apocrypha is Greek in origin, and it signifies books that are hidden away. He further explains from the point of view of those who approved of these books that they were hidden or withdrawn from common use because they were regarded as containing mysterious or esoteric lore, too profound to be communicated to any except the initiated. From another point of view, however, it was held that such books deserved to be hidden because they were spurious and heretical. Thus the term has had both an honorable and derogatory significance, depending upon those who made use of the word. It's also been suggested by some Anglicans that a more appropriate term for these books is ecclesiastical, and see Richard Hooker for evidence of this. He believed the books should be called ecclesiastical books because this is what they were referred to by some of the fathers. So, how did these books end up in any Bible to begin with? Well, these works were written by the Jews in the period after the conquering of the Babylonians by the Persians and before the appearance of John the Baptist. We're roughly talking about the era from the 4th century BC to the 1st century BC. Now, how have these books been viewed? When we talk about these books, we begin to talk about things like canonicity, the canonicity of books of the Bible. The canon of Scripture is the books of the Bible that are recognized as genuine and inspired and are used to establish doctrine for the church. Canon comes from Latin, and it originally comes from the Greek. A canon was a measuring rod or a standard. What about these views of the canonicity of the Apocrypha? This is important. If we don't know the canonicity of the books, we don't know how to use them. A modern Protestant view is exemplified by the Westminster Confession of Faith from 1646 A.D., chapter 1, section 3. It says, "The books commonly called Apocrypha, not being of divine inspiration, are no part of the canon of Scripture, and are therefore of no authority in the Church of God, nor to be anywise or be any otherwise approved or made use of, other than as human writings." So that's pretty well reflects a modern Protestant view of the books of the Apocrypha. What about a Catholic view or a modern Roman Catholic view of the books of the Apocrypha? If we go all the way back to St. Jerome, he distinguished between books that were canonical books and ecclesiastical books. The later, he judged, were not recognized as authoritative scripture. The situation remained unclear in the ensuing centuries. For example, John of Damascus, Gregory the Great, Walafrid, Nicholas of Lyra, Tostado continued to doubt the canonicity of the deuterocanonical books. According to Catholic doctrine, the proximate criterion of the biblical canon is the infallible decision of the Church. This decision was not given until rather late in the history of the Roman Church at the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent definitively settled the matter of the Old Testament canon. This had not been done previously. This had not been done previously is apparent from the uncertainty that persisted up to the time of Trent. So in other words, what is being said here is that the canon, the Roman Catholic canon, and their view of the books of the Apocrypha was never a settled matter until the Council of Trent in 1546. What I just read to you is a quote from the New Catholic Encyclopedia on the Canon of Scripture. That's a Roman Catholic source telling you that they did not have a settled canon regarding the Apocrypha until after the Reformation. The Council of Trent said this: "If anyone receive not as sacred and canonical the said books entire with all their parts, as they have been read in the Catholic Church, and as they are contained in the old Latin Vulgate, and knowingly and deliberately rejects the aforesaid traditions, let him be accursed." So they're pronouncing an anathema on anybody who rejects the canonicity of the Apocrypha. When the Roman Catholic Church did this at the Council of Trent, it is their first definitive statement on this matter. For an older view of the books, we go back to St. Jerome, and we go back to the 4th century. St. Jerome distinguished between canonical books, the Old Testament, and the ecclesiastical books, the Apocrypha. That's a distinction that we see in our own Anglican theologian, Richard Hooker. The books of the Apocrypha, he judged, were circulated by the Church as good and spiritual writings, but they were not recognized as authoritative scripture. And this is also from the New Catholic Encyclopedia. The interesting thing about this is that this view of Scripture comports well with the view of the Apocrypha in the 39 Articles, and also with the Lutheran Bible, the Luther Bible from 1534. In the title to the Apocrypha section, it says, in English, "Apocrypha, that is, books which are not to be esteemed like the Holy Scriptures, and yet which are useful and good to read." So the Lutheran view reflects the view of St. Jerome, as does the Anglican view in the 39 Articles. Also of interest to Anglicans here is that the Venerable Bede writing in the 8th century, in his commentary on Revelation, gives the books of the Old Testament in conformity with the list provided by St. Jerome. When we look to the Articles of Religion, Article number 6 of the Sufficiency of Holy Scriptures for Salvation, we have all the books of the Old Testament listed out. And then the 39 article says, "And the other books, as Jerome saith, the church doth read for example of life and instruction of manners, but yet doth it not apply them to establish any doctrine. Such are these following." And then it gives the list that I read earlier. The view on the New Testament books is not different. What about the books of the Old Testament? What books should be included in the Old Testament? It's a very good question. For me, I think one of the best statements about the canonicity of the Old Testament books comes from St. Paul in his epistle to the Romans. He says in chapter 3 and verse 2, "Unto the Jews were committed the oracles of God." And so up until that point at which Jesus Christ came, we have to recognize that the canonicity of Scripture was committed into the hands of the Jews. And so their view of these things should be taken very seriously by us. The Jews do not accept the books of the Apocrypha as canonical. The Jewish view of these writings is similar to the Anglican view as reflected in the 39 articles, which I've read. One of the things you will see is that modern Roman Catholic apologists, in an effort to support their view, which was established at the Council of Trent, will sometimes assert that the rabbis at the Council of Jamnia in the 1st century established the Jewish canon. In other words, the Jewish canon was not established by the Jews until the 1st century, or that they revised it in the 1st century. But the Council of Jamnia did no such thing. The only thing it did was it merely affirm the existing canon of Scripture. This is affirmed by respected evangelical scholars. For example, F.F. Bruce, he says, "The rabbis at Jamnia introduced no innovations. They received the tradition they had received and left it more or less the way it was. It is probably unwise to talk as if there was a council or synod at Jamnia which laid down the limits of the Old Testament canon." And by Jewish scholars, and this comes from a rabbi at the Talmud Torah Center for Basic Jewish Education. On the subject, he writes regarding the Jewish canon, "According to Jewish tradition, the Bible was sealed during the period of the men of the Great Assembly, at the very beginning of the Second Temple period. The last book to be added was the book of Esther. So the many of the apocryphal books, such as the book of Maccabees, were not written until well after the sealing of the Jewish canon. According to Jewish belief, the men of the Great Assembly were the last true prophets until Messianic times. No other group has the authority to add a book to the canon, so later books could not even be considered. In any case, the apocryphal books have never carried any authority in Jewish tradition. Some of them are considered reliable books for historical studies. Others may have some legitimate basis as inspirational writing. However, none have ever been considered equal to biblical writings. There is simply no basis to support any claim otherwise." And so that reflects a Jewish view of the canon and where the Apocrypha fits with the canon. Another reference to the Council of Jamnia says that what happened at Jamnia really wasn't a situation where books were being considered to be added into the canon. That when the rabbis looked at the canon of Scripture, they actually were looking more at the right of the books that were there to remain there. So rather than adding books they looked at maybe some of the books that are in there should be removed. But that was not done. One of the other things when we consider canon and the canonicity of these books is that there is no single view of these books. When we look at the books that are accepted by Jews, Protestants, Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholics, Orthodox Anglicans, the books of the Old Testament we all agree on. When we get to the Apocrypha, the books of the Apocrypha as we refer to them, there's no agreement on these books. The number of books, which books are included, differ from the Eastern Orthodox Church to the Anglican and Lutheran tradition to the Roman Catholic tradition and obviously to the Jewish tradition. In other words, there is no agreement. Each one of these groups has a different view of which books belong in and which books belong out. Clearly, this is an indication that this is an unsettled matter. Even when the Eastern Orthodox Church and Roman Catholic Church are said to have agreement on the canonicity of a book or whether a book should be included, when we look at the translations of the Apocrypha that are circulating today are wildly different. If you look at a King James translation of the Apocrypha and then look at another translation of the Apocrypha, you'll see there's a great difference in the text itself. And so we have different numbers of books, we have wildly different texts, and so it's very different. The Latin Vulgate and the Greek Old Testament texts and the English translations from those texts vary immensely. So the lack of a truly Catholic or universal view of the canonicity of the books supports the traditional Anglican view of the Apocrypha. These books are not accepted as canonical by the Church Catholic. One other note I would add is, according to Bruce Metzger, and this is not something I'm familiar with, but according to Bruce Metzger in his book, Eastern Orthodox priests, it's basically left up to them individually in their own conscience as how they teach from the Apocrypha, the books we call the Apocrypha. So if the Apocrypha is not canonical, why should we read it? That's a very good question. Washington Irving's 19th century story of Rip Van Winkle is probably not as well known today as it once was, but when I was thinking about the importance of Jewish history and the intertestamental period, that story came to mind. A person who's familiar with the Old Testament approaches the New Testament only to discover that the New Testament world is very different than the Old Testament world that you became familiar with reading the books of the Old Testament. This time, instead of only 20 years having passed, as was the case with Rip Van Winkle, 400 years have gone by. This is a time period for the Jews when the Jews were not the prime movers. Instead, they were forced to react to these greater powers that were moving all about them. On the whole, using the windshield and the bug analogy, the Jewish people were clearly a bug at this point in time. And the domino that sets the Jews into direct confrontation with the Greeks and Hellenism continues throughout the intertestamental period, and this is initiated by the conquest of Alexander the Great. Alexander was not only successful in battle, he was successful in exporting Greek culture. And his rule ended with his death in 322 BC, and his kingdom was divided, and Palestine was put under the rule of the Greek general Ptolemy. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Palestine from its capital in Alexandria, where Ptolemy, a Macedonian, had initially been installed as the governor. The period of Ptolemaic rule is one in which the Jews had a degree of self-rule. In other words, they had some say in what they were doing. They also appeared to have a degree of religious liberty. The Ptolemaic dynasty lost control of Palestine to the Seleucids, but continued to exist until the defeat of Cleopatra in 30 BC. The Seleucids represent one of the other portions of the empire of Alexander the Great. Seleucus, another one of Alexander's generals, was the first ruler of this empire, and their capital was near Antioch in Syria. The empire itself sprawled through much of Asia Minor, and in 198 they took over Palestine, displacing the Ptolemies. Now at this time, while we have the Seleucids in Palestine controlling things, slowly we hear the footsteps of the Roman Empire coming. Their answer was a campaign of forced Hellenization. They would cause the people of Palestine to adopt Greek ways. This began a dark and desperate era for the Jews. Circumcision was outlawed, the temple desecrated, and numerous injustices were perpetrated. The injustice was too great to sit back and do nothing, so the Jews began a successful revolt, the Maccabean revolt, led by Judas Maccabeus. They defeated the Seleucid army on several occasions and were able to occupy Jerusalem. The temple was then rededicated in 164 BC and religious liberty restored. And people are familiar with this because this is commemorated by the Jews with the holiday of Hanukkah. The initial revolt of the Jews a success, they decided to attempt political autonomy and go with their newly won religious freedom and began a second revolt. The end result was the establishment of the Hasmonean dynasty, which would last until the coming of the Romans. In 63 BC, the Roman general Pompey moved in and occupied Jerusalem. Continuing strife led him to install a Jewish proselyte by the name of Herod as king of Judah, which may sound familiar to you. Though king, Herod was still obedient to Rome. This is the final change in the political landscape before the first events of the New Testament. Those familiar with the gospel narrative will find a Herod on the throne and Roman rule familiar territory. So one of the reasons we should read the Apocrypha is to learn more about the historical situation that we find in the New Testament. How did we get from the political situation we find in the Old Testament to the political situation we find in the New Testament? And the Apocrypha is a bridge to that. One of the good reasons to read the Apocrypha is so that you'll be able to fully understand the New Testament. And one of the most important rules for understanding and interpreting Scripture is that you must always be conscious of context. Context, context, context. And knowledge of the Apocrypha is essential to grasping the evolution of the political environment, the social and religious customs during that 400-year period between the Old Testament and the coming of the Messiah. Another question that we might ask ourselves, or you might ask, is how did these books that were not considered by the Jews end up in collections of books that were canonical? In other words, how did a mingling of these books happen? It's a good question. The influence of the Greek culture and Hellenism among the Jews of the diaspora in places like Alexandria created a need for Greek texts of the Old Testament scriptures. Though there were many of these texts, the Greek translations began to become known as the Septuagint. However, the Jews of the diaspora also had other writings and more recent writings. These had been produced in the Greek language, many of them. Some of them translated. But these books were combined in collections with the canonical scriptures. The fact that they were sometimes combined with the Greek translations of the Old Testament by the Jews of the diaspora is as close as these books will ever get to official recognition by the Jews. That's it. That's as close as they ever got to any official recognition by the Jews, that they were included sometimes with their collections of books. Now, there are two other terms that are important when we talk about the Apocrypha, and this is would go into the general information category. And one is the Roman Catholic term deuterocanonical. The term literally means belonging to a second canon. The deuterocanonical books are mostly the same as those referred to by Anglicans and Lutherans as the Apocrypha, yet they have a different organization. As the term implies, they're considered canonical by the Roman Church, and that was made official, as we read earlier, at the Council of Trent. Finally, there's the term pseudepigrapha. The pseudepigrapha title is applied to texts mostly written between 200 BC and 200 AD. These texts were spuriously ascribed to various prophets and kings of the Hebrew Scriptures. Pseudepigraphal writings are also sometimes referred to as apocrypha, but this is a mistake. They have been universally rejected by all traditions of the church. The only one that seems to be very interested in them is modern-day Gnostics. And so, for the first lesson, the assignment, at least one of the assignments you will need to complete, is to read Ezra and Nehemiah from the Old Testament. And because reading the books Ezra and Nehemiah will help us make this transition to the Apocrypha. I hope this lecture has been informative to you and will provide you with information on both why the Apocrypha is not considered to be used to establish doctrine, but yet it is considered useful. We will continue looking at both of those things through this course, and I hope this course will be a blessing to you and a blessing to the church.